I've had 2 weeks to think about what I'm going to talk about tonight. But before I get into that, for folks that are watching the recording rather than attending the class live, last week I made a mistake when I was playing with the lighting, and in order to get up from my chair, I stopped the recording instead of pausing it. And the consequence of that is that when the recording was posted to YouTube, the first part was not posted to YouTube, the first 10 minutes. So if you watched the recording last week, you came in 10 minutes after things had started. And that first 10 minutes was actually fairly important because I was sort of laying out the context and the plan of what I was doing. So the techies at Tubta Norbuling have kindly stitched that missing 10 minutes on to the last recording. So if you're interested in doing so, you might want to go back to the recording that's posted on YouTube. It's called Extended, and listen to that first 10 minutes if you listen to the previous recording starting 10 minutes into the recording at a point which would have made no sense at all. You probably would have thought that David has lost his mind and there's something strange going on here. Well, David may have lost his mind, but it was actually a pretty simple error. So you might want to check that out. Okay, so for this evening, I've had 2 weeks now to think about what I wanted to do by way of a presentation tonight. And it's driven me a little bit nuts. I felt like I've been going around in circles and sort of chasing my own tail, trying to figure out what's the best way to get into this material. And I'm not entirely sure why that has been the case, but I'm going to offer some thoughts about that, which might actually be useful for helping you to get into the book. And as I said earlier, or in last week's talk, Kamalashila was writing this book, which in Sanskrit is Bhavanakrama, was writing this book for Tibetans. He wrote it in Tibet for Tibetans. This is one of the first books written by an Indian scholar, practitioner, saint, for Tibetans in Tibet. And he was assessing the situation of Tibetan practitioners as he saw it at that time. And as I said last week, that's one of the things that I think makes the book useful for us, because now we have the Dharma coming to the Western world, and are we prepared for it in some ways? And can we deal with it in certain ways? One of the things that I thought a lot about, actually I thought a lot about it over my lifetime of practice, but in particular in the last couple of weeks I thought a lot about, is this book and many of the teachings that the early teachers from India were offering to the Tibetans were given to monks. They were not offered to lay people. The intention was to provide guidance for people, mostly men, but not entirely, provide guidance for how to practice when you're living a monastic life. Well, we don't live a monastic life. I mean, I know a few people who live a sort of a monastic life or a semi-monastic life, but most of us who are interested in the Buddhist teachings and the Buddha Dharma are not monastic. We have lives that were unimaginable to those monks, for one thing. But we have all kinds of responsibilities that take us away from what might be spiritual practice. Plus, our minds are developed in ways that their minds were not developed. I was wasting my time on Facebook the other day, something I do every once in a while. I'm actually thinking I should cancel my subscription to Facebook because I spend too much time doing that. But every once in a while, a little pearl of something useful shows up. And one of the pearls that showed up in the last actually several days, I want to share with you because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about here. And back in the 1970s, I believe it was the 1970s, the former Karmapa, in other words, the Karmapa in his last lifetime, came to North America on a tour. And he was asked by a journalist, what did he think was wrong with the Western world? So that's kind of a setup right there to even phrase the question that way. But anyway, he was asked that question, and his first response apparently was, you don't want to know what I think. And the journalist said, yes, I do. What's wrong? What's the problem? And he answered in one word, overstimulation. Overstimulation. 1970s, no internet, no cell phones. If you wanted to know something about what was going on in the world, you had to wait for the newspaper to show up or for Time magazine to show up or something like that. It didn't jump all over you the way information does now. If you wanted to be entertained, you could go to listen to some music someplace. You had to get there. You could turn on your radio or maybe your stereo, but if you were really into appreciating the sound of music, you had to go to hear live music because the sound wasn't really all that great coming out of your stereo. If you're into watching TV and your idea of entertainment was Bonanza, then you had to wait until Sunday night. You couldn't just say, I want to watch Bonanza, and fire up the Roku or whatever the heck it is and watch Bonanza. It's unceasing, right? Well, I don't know what the Karmapa would have said of the current situation, but it is our situation, and we have minds which are extremely distracted. I find that's my main problem as a practitioner, my distracted mind. Well, we can think of all kinds of reasons why this is relevant, but in particular, in relationship to this book, the reason it's relevant is the position that Kamalashila is taking, and that, in fact, the Dalai Lama is taking, because he's teaching from that point of view that Kamalashila has, is that in order to really develop spiritually, you must develop calm abiding, which is single-pointed meditation, the ability to hold your mind on something. And then when you develop calm abiding, on top of that, you develop what's called special insight in this book, which is vipassana, which is the analytic understanding of what it is you're looking at. That's essential. Well, how many of us are ever going to develop calm abiding? Right. Shayla is kind of smiling and shaking her head like, how likely is that? So does that mean that the Buddhist path is foreclosed to us? I don't think it does. But I think that we have to look at what these teachings are that Kamalashila is giving us from a certain perspective, which is a different perspective than he certainly had, but also a different perspective that the monks had for whom this was written, a different perspective than the monks and nuns had throughout the centuries of Tibetan history when this text was studied, and even, I'll venture to say, a different perspective than the Dalai Lama has, because he's the prime monastic. He's like the perfect monk, really, if you get right down to it. with the most exquisite training, right? I think he understands Westerners pretty well. And I think he's laying out what the ideal path is. But I think there's some serious question, at least for me, about how much of that we can actually do in the way in which it's presented. Now, I'm going to pop in here and read a quotation in his commentary, which really stuck with me. If you ever want to look it up, this is on page 18 of Stages of Meditation. One thing that should be very clear is that Dharma teachings have only one purpose: to discipline the mind. Teachers should pay attention and see to it that their teachings benefit the minds of their students. Okay. But here's really the main point that I wanted to get at. Their instructions must be based upon their personal experience of understanding the Dharma. Their instructions must be based upon their personal experience of understanding the Dharma. So that puts me in a quandary, because in this book I have to talk about shamatha and vipassana, one-pointed meditation or placement meditation, and advanced analytical meditation that you do after shamatha. And I have the same monkey mind as everybody else who's listening to this talk. I sit down to meditate, and every distraction in the world pops into my mind. In the last week, we've been having some work done on our house. And you can't imagine the sort of, well, maybe you can imagine the sort of distractions that have been, running through my mind. I mean, I'm not talking about when I'm trying to meditate while the banging, sawing, clonking, and whatnot is going on essentially in the next room. I'm just talking about, are they doing it the right way? Should I have told them to do it differently? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? Is that the right material? Should it be smooth side out or rough side out? Oh, I told them smooth side out. Maybe it should have been rough side out. Too late. They're already screwing the planks in. I can't change anything. Is this strong enough to hold? I mean, it was just, it was unbelievable. It was on and on. My mind was driving me crazy. And I'm sure that we all have similar types of experiences in our lives, because there are things that are going on in our lives that are like that. So how the heck do we do this practice? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my cue from this statement of His Holiness that the teachers should teach from their own experience. And what I'm going to do is share my thoughts about the stuff that's in the book, not based upon my having some great experience or some profound understanding, but I have been thinking about some things for a long time. And I will share those thoughts. And if you find them useful, then that's great. Then I've accomplished my purpose and I've done something useful, which is the whole point of being a teacher. So that's by way of another prologue, and it's very important. Now, when I was trying to figure out how to get into this material, one of the first things that I noticed was the sequence of the way Kamalashila presents his teachings. He starts out by talking about the development of omniscience. That's the term that's used here. That's what he's really saying when he talks about developing omniscience, is he's talking about becoming a Buddha. So the goal of Buddhist practice is to become a Buddha. Now, is that realistic for any of us? Well, it's often said that from the point of view of the sutra path, it takes 3 incalculable eons to become a Buddha. So you better have a lot of patience. On the other hand, from the point of view of the Tantra path, you can become enlightened. You can become a Buddha in 1 lifetime. Of course, you have to develop shamatha. So that suggests some obvious limitations if you have my kind of monkey mind. But everything isn't hopeless. But the point is that this book and the commentary is all from the sutra point of view. It is not from the tantric point of view. And it's not that Kamalashila didn't understand the tantric point of view. He did. And obviously His Holiness does. But there's a way of making a presentation, and it's from the point of view of sutra, and the commentaries on the sutra, shastra, to use the Sanskrit. So he begins by saying, the goal is omniscience, that is, to become a Buddha. And in order to do so, you have to accumulate the causes for that. And what are the causes for that? And he says the prime cause for that is compassion. So the first chapter is about what is the goal, omniscience, and the necessity for accumulating the causes. And the second chapter then gets into compassion as the prime cause. And from that, bodhicitta, because the development of bodhicitta is on the foundation of compassion and loving kindness. And then it goes on from that, and then finally gets into talking about the more advanced meditation practices. So I thought about that. I thought, well, why did Kamalashila do that? Why did he approach things that way? I mean, usually when Buddhism is presented to beginners, teachers will very frequently start with the 4 Noble Truths. We all experience suffering. There's a cause of suffering, which is grasping desire. Suffering can cease. There is a cessation. And the way to bring about the cessation is the Eightfold Path. And in the Eightfold Path, there are things like right view, which is essentially what's developed with special insight, and concentration, which is shamatha. So that stuff is in there, right? But Kamalashila takes a somewhat unique view. And yet, on the other hand, as His Holiness has very frequently said, the 4 Noble Truths are a teaching about causality. If you get right down to it, they're a teaching about causality. And if you think about it in the context in which the Buddha was teaching, it gets a different sort of flavor. In the Buddha's time, people often thought that when something happened, it happened as a result of some external, transpersonal, godlike force that was acting upon some situation. And that's why things happened the way they did. The Buddha was saying, no, you have to take responsibility for what's happening. And part of your taking responsibility is recognizing what the law of causation is, which is that if something is happening, there's a cause for it, and you accumulated that cause. And you can do something about it, by the way, by accumulating other kinds of causes and by not doing things that bring about the stuff that you don't like. This boils down to this idea now in Buddhism of taming the mind, because it's the mind essentially that creates the problems. So if something problematic is happening, then the source of it ultimately is your own mind. And the solution to that problem that you're dealing with is also in your own mind. That's where the remedy is. So Kamalashila actually does begin there, but in a funny way, because he begins by talking about causality of becoming a Buddha, rather than the causality for our being miserable. But he does get into that down the line. Thought about how to get into this material. I decided to start with the idea of suffering. And there are a number of reasons for that. So the chapter on suffering is chapter 5, identifying the nature of suffering. So I'm going to start there tonight. And there are a number of reasons for my starting there. But one is that I've been experiencing a lot of suffering in this last part of my life. It's been on my mind for all kinds of obvious reasons if you're experiencing deep suffering. And sometimes the suffering that I've experienced is straightforward kind of suffering, which is, well, in my case, I went through many years of morbid insomnia where I only slept 3 hours a night for years at a time. And I can't describe what the pain was of that kind of experience. That kind of suffering, although it's not something that most people experience, that kind of suffering has a specific name in the Buddhist tradition. And you can find that on page 61. And here it's called the misery of suffering. And on this page, 3 types of suffering are identified. Okay. And this is now traditional in later Buddhism. There's the suffering of ordinary physical suffering, which here is called the misery of suffering. And as His Holiness says, this refers to what we usually recognize as suffering, such as physical pain, sickness, and mental anxiety, by the way. By the way, he says what we usually recognize as happiness is characterized as the misery of change. Why is that? Well, according to this tradition, what we usually identify as happiness is a temporary apparent cessation of suffering. But happiness itself actually leads to more suffering. Why is that? Because the other kind of suffering that we're always experiencing is called the misery or the suffering of change. The Buddha taught that the world and everything we experience in the world is impermanent. That means it's always changing. Everything is changing. From moment to moment, everything is constantly changing. So the joys that we experience are always contaminated by our realization that they don't last. So I thought about this, and I had to ask myself, how true is this teaching? I mean, Buddhism is kind of an interesting philosophy or interesting religion, because the scriptures, the texts, the teachers, they always say, investigate this for yourself. Just because we say it, don't believe it. Just because it's written in scripture, don't believe it. Check it out for yourself. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to do that. I mean, it wasn't hard to understand about the misery of misery, straight out physical suffering after all that insomnia. Or if you have a toothache, you know what that's all about. Or if you get old enough and you get arthritis and your joints start aching all the time, or these kinds of things, then you know what straight out misery is. But I had to ask myself, is this the case always? Aren't there exceptions to this? So I thought about it a lot, and I thought there were many instances in my life where I would do something that I thought would bring me a lot of joy. And then when I would do it, it was like, it was hollow. It wasn't there. The joy wasn't there. When I lived in San Francisco, which, I mean, in the 1980s, for example, in San Francisco, if you had some money, which my wife and I did, boy, you could entertain yourself unbelievably. I mean, it was pretty amazing. And we gave it a go. But there were plenty of times when it was like I'd be sitting in some great restaurant ordering a great meal, and it was kind of like, yeah, okay, that's nice. Okay, here I am in San Francisco eating in a world-class restaurant, eating maybe the best Italian cuisine you can find on the planet at great expense, which I've been looking forward to for a long time. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know, I'd probably be just as happy sitting at home on my balcony eating a cheese sandwich, watching the fog roll in. But not always. Sometimes it's like, oh, this is really pretty great. But if I looked at it honestly, well, this is really pretty great, actually was in the minority of experiences. So then I thought about some other experiences. Kay and I used to go bicycling in Golden Gate Park because we always lived on the west side of the city. When I look back on it, that was actually the very best thing we ever did in our time in San Francisco. It was absolute joy as far as I was concerned to be doing that. So then I had to ask myself, so what's with this Buddhist teaching? Okay, the Italian restaurant example, that was okay, I got it. You know, things didn't always live up to expectations. But, you know, bicycling in the velodrome in Golden Gate Park in the late afternoon when the fog was rolling in, that was better than expectations. So maybe some of this Buddhist teaching I don't know about. Well, for one thing, I would get tired because I was already an old guy by then. I would get tired, but that was okay. That felt all right. So, but, you know, so now there's the suffering of change entering in here. I mean, the suffering of suffering, straight out misery isn't here. I'm having too much fun. I'm not experiencing any of that. But it is true, and I was aware of the fact that at some point I was going to have to get off the loop, whether I did it 10 times or 20 times, or I bicycled until I couldn't go any farther and the fog was so thick I was soaking wet. I was going to have to stop. It had to come to a stop. That was the suffering of change. And when it came to a stop, I was going to have to somewhat achingly get myself home, take a shower, go to bed, and go to work the next day. That was the suffering of change. So yeah, that's pretty real. Okay, that suffering is pretty real. And that's always in there with joy. I had to realize that was true. It was always in there with joy. You can have joy, which is just straight joy, no pain involved, except that it is going to end. So maybe you don't think about it too much, or do you think about it before it comes to an end? I wasn't so sure about that. But then there's the third kind of suffering, which is translated here as pervasive misery. I don't want to get grim and glum here, but anyway, pervasive misery. I'm going to read something. Again, this is His Holiness on page 61. Pervasive misery refers to sentient beings' collection of mental and physical constituents, known as the contaminated aggregates, which result from past karma and disturbing emotions and act as an agent to generate further karma and disturbing emotions. There may be occasions when we are disturbed by neither the misery of suffering nor the misery of change. But as long as we are not separated from our contaminated mental and physical aggregates, they will continue to provide the basis for various kinds of misery. And when they come into contact with the appropriate factors and conditions, suffering is bound to arise. Therefore, it is essential to think about these three types of misery, pervasive misery. So I want to talk about this. In other texts that I've read or teachings that I've attended, this kind of suffering is described in a somewhat different way. And it's what I would describe as existential suffering, fundamental dissatisfaction, fundamental ill at easeness. Excuse me. I once read that the original term that the Buddha used for sort of the suffering of the human condition or the human situation was that it was like a wheel that was not properly mounted on an axle and it wobbled. Now, I think we can maybe understand that image somewhat abstractly. I mean, these days, everything is so well made mechanically that the idea that a wheel is not properly mounted on an axle and it wobbles would be kind of outside of our experience. But, back in the Buddha's days, wheels were actually something fairly new. Well, maybe that's not a very good statement. But I mean, there weren't a lot of wheeled vehicles around. That's really what I'm trying to say, And they were more crudely made. And so, yeah, a wheel that was wobbling was something that people would see. So I've thought about it. Yeah. I've spent a lot of my time thinking that my life is pretty wobbly. That seems pretty realistic. This wobbliness is the existential suffering. This existential suffering is the core problem. We can be the richest person in the world. We can have the greatest health with all kinds of wealth. Everybody loves us. Everything's going well in our lives. And yet, existential suffering is still there. And in fact, I think that very wealthy people are often particularly more aware of existential suffering than ordinary folks like the rest of us. Why is that? Well, as a friend of mine once said, I guess he wasn't really a friend of mine, given what he was telling me. He was playing mind games with me. He was saying, I will never have to worry about not having enough money to feed myself. I mean, he was saying, look, you're an old guy, your money's going to run out. You're like an ordinary dude. You've got an IRA of a limited size. If you outlive your IRA, you're going to have problems. I'm rich. I don't have to worry about that stuff. But existential suffering is still there. What does that look like? What do I mean by that? And how does that manifest? Well, in that particular case, it manifested in mind games. He had to prove something. It wasn't okay to just be very rich. He had to be powerful. He had to be one up over me. He had to prove something. I've often wondered why it is that the oligarchs of this country, the billionaires, act the way they do. And I've tried to talk to other people about this, but I don't know anybody that knows any billionaires. So this has always been kind of an abstract discussion, What is it that motivates these people to try and get control of the levers of government, to make more money, to extract more money from their workers? What is it that goes on in Jeff Bezos' mind that, as rich as he is, the warehouse workers at Amazon are exploited? Wouldn't it be okay if he made less money and they made more money? he would still be a disgustingly rich billionaire, but that's not the way he thinks about things, as far as I can tell. He still wants to be making more money, right? And his ilk is involved in the politics in this country. Why? What are they doing? Why do they want to get control of things? Right? Okay, I'm going to venture a thought, because this is sort of maybe a metaphor or an example. I think that they're running away from existential suffering. I think they're avoiding the reality of their situation, which is you can be filthy rich, you can be beautiful, you can be famous, and guess what? You're going to get old and you're going to die, period. No exception. You know, they used to say death and taxes are the only certainties in life. We now know if you're rich enough, taxes are not a certainty in life. Death is still a certainty in life, no matter how rich you are, right? That is existential suffering. And it's on our minds all the time, whether we accept it and pay attention to it or ignore it. It's always there. Whether we run away from it by doing whatever we do, like running out to fancy Italian restaurants or flying private jets or trying to control the government or whatever it is that we try and do to get away from it, it's always there. I think that that's what this third kind of suffering is, not just the awareness of death, but a fundamental level in which there's a discomfort, a dissatisfaction. The existentialists, the French existentialists in particular, explored this in great depth, especially in the 1950s. People like Sartre, Camus, they were very aware of this kind of what I would call existential suffering. Okay, so the Buddhists are very aware of it also. But they take, the Buddhist scholars and advanced Buddhist practitioners, but they take a different approach to dealing with it. You know, not drinking yourself into unconsciousness, not trying to get control of the government. There are always princes, even back in the time of the Buddha, you know, who are doing these kinds of things. But to get at what does this mean and how do we live in relationship to this process? And how do we deal with it? Okay. So enough grim and glum, but there it is. So how do we deal with it? This is really what Kamalashila is about, even though he doesn't begin at this point. Go back to this quotation from His Holiness. As long as we're not separated from our contaminated mental and physical aggregates, in other words, if we have a body and a mind, they will provide the basis for various kinds of misery. And when they come into contact with the appropriate factors and conditions, suffering is bound to arise. So the Buddhist solution to the problem is to recognize clearly what's going on, that we're stuck in the situation of things constantly changing, that we will be brought into contact with what we don't like and what we don't want. We will lose what we do like and what we want to keep, but we will also be brought into contact with what we want and will be taken away from what we don't want. That this is the round that we're in, right? As I mentioned before, the Buddhist wheel of life in the paintings has three creatures at the hub of the wheel: snake, cock, and pig. And they represent attraction to things, repulsion, and ignorance, confusion, not understanding what's going on. And ignorance is the key. right? So when His Holiness is talking about the fact that as long as we have contaminated mind and body, and I'm not going to go into what that means exactly right now, we're constantly going to be engaging with our process of being attracted to things and being repelled by things, which is driven by our own confusion. Is it possible? Well, again, I'm asking myself, is it possible to do something about this? I mean, the Buddhists say, of course it is. But for ordinary folks like us, is it possible to do anything about this? Right? Now, if you develop shamatha and you gain complete control of your mind, then when the factors come up that would ordinarily cause a reaction and lead to suffering, you can stop it, right? Because the usual mental response is not going to be what your response is, because you have one point of concentration. So you can prevent that reaction, you can stop it. But I don't have one point of concentration. So when stuff comes up, can I do anything about it? Well, there's what I do on the meditation cushion and what I do off the meditation cushion. Unfortunately, when I'm driving down Cerrillos Boulevard, I have a lot to say about the other drivers around here. So but I'm not on the meditation cushion. I'm trying to avoid being T-boned, tailgated. I have my windows rolled up so I don't have to breathe the exhaust from the other cars, which may or may not have reasonable mufflers on them. I mean, I can go down the entire list. If you spend any time in Santa Fe, you know what I'm talking about. There's nothing abstract about this. It would be nice if I could do something about my mind in those moments. That's very hard for me to do. But often my wife is in the car with me, so I've been practicing what I have to say or don't have to say about what's going on, because she's gotten fed up with my commentary. So, okay, so I may not say much. I certainly don't do anything like cut people off or get out and shoot them, which does in fact happen around here, you well know. A lot of cutting off, not too much shooting, fortunately. Having control of my mind is more of a problem. But then there's sitting on the meditation cushion, and that gives me different kinds of options. And I want to get into this because I think it's the case for all of us. I mean, maybe you don't have a problem on Cerrillos or the equivalent of Cerrillos in your life, whatever that might be, whether it's the daily commute or what happens in the office or where you're working, whatever the case may be. We all have our Cerrillos Boulevard. But we also all have the opportunity to spend some time practicing meditation. So what might it look like? What can we ordinary people do, right, when we're sitting on the meditation cushion and we're wanting a little peace of mind, right? We're wanting to extract ourselves from as many types of suffering as possible. Can we extract ourselves from this existential suffering? So that's a very interesting question for me. So again, His Holiness says, teach from your own experience. So now I'm going to refer to my own experience. And hopefully it's something that's useful for you all, the students, since I'm the teacher. The problem is impermanence, right? The problem is change. That's the fundamental issue that's underlying all the sufferings. So when meditating, it's possible to contemplate those three sufferings as outcomes of change, of impermanence, of transformation. And His Holiness is basically saying this is what you should do. You should learn about these different kinds of sufferings, because then this is a motivation for your practice. It's also something that you want to deal with because you might want some peace of mind. That's certainly what I want. You can see, if you're calm enough when you're meditating, you can see the changes going on around you, and you can see them as changes. You can see the impermanence. You can see the transformation of things. Sometimes those things come up as irritants. For example, dogs in the backyard next to me. It seems inevitable when I sit down to meditate that the dogs will decide to make a lot of racket. Maybe they're telepathic or something. They know that I'm sitting down to meditate and they're going to bug me. It certainly seems that way sometimes. But they bark and then they stop barking. They bark and then they stop barking. So I can react to the barking as an irritant, or I can look at the barking as an example of change, transformation, impermanence. Now it's happening, now it's not happening. Now it's happening this way, now it's not happening this way. What's the cause of this happening? Why are they barking? Why am I reacting to their barking in the way that I am? Why does it bother me? If my cat comes through the living room, which is where I sit and meditate, and meows, it doesn't bother me. But if the dogs are barking, it bothers me. What's the difference between the cat meowing and the dog barking? Well, the fundamental difference is me. I mean, actually, from the point of view of decibels, it might not be all that great, because the cat is next to me and the dogs are in the yard behind me. So the meow may be just as loud as the barking, but it doesn't bother me. So what is the difference? Now, we'll get into talking about equanimity probably next week rather than this week, because that's related to this issue. It's the practice which underlies compassion and loving kindness. But I don't have equanimity, obviously, in the way I'm reacting. So how could I cut through that is sort of the question that occurs to me when it's happening, because I can see that it's happening now. I can see that I'm okay with Betty Boop the cat, but I'm not okay with the German shepherds behind me, right? That's me that's not okay, and that's okay. What's going on here? One of the main Buddhist teachings, and this is going to sound like a strange going off at a 90-degree angle, okay? But one of the principal Buddhist teachings, as you know, is the teaching of emptiness, the lack of inherent existence of things, as it's usually said. Things are empty of inherent existence. They are not what they seem. They seem to be solid. They seem to have their own absolute characteristics. Those are not on the side of the object, or they're not on the side of what's being observed, but they're coming from us. We project characteristics onto the phenomena of our experience that aren't really there in that object. So that object is empty of what we're projecting onto it. Okay, so this is the fundamental teaching. Okay, so why is it that meowing cat is okay and barking dog is not okay? It's because something I'm projecting onto barking dog versus something I'm projecting onto meowing cat. Now, these are things that I can see when I'm meditating. And I don't have to be some great meditator or some great, yogi with great experience of shamatha to do this. This is just very simple thinking about what's going on. And it's not that this is a bad thing to do when you're meditating, because remember, there are different kinds of meditation. And one kind of meditation is to examine excuse me, is to examine what's going on in your experience, to look closely at it. So here I'm looking closely at the difference between meow and bark. You know, put it down to something very simple between meow and bark. Meow good, bark bad. That's David. What's going on there, David? Okay. Oh, it's coming from you. It's not coming from them. This occurs to me. Does that change anything? Well, guess what? It does. In my experience, it does. Because now I'm looking at an example of changes going on in the world around me. The barking starts, the barking stops. I'm looking at changes going on in the world around me. And I'm looking at how I am relating to those changes. So now, subjectively speaking, I've backed up away from the raw experience of bark and meow into a whole other level of relationship to the process. Just making sense? You know, that you sort of backed away as you've gotten more analytic. And as you backed away, or as I've backed away, everything calms down. Oh, barking, meowing. Oh, not that much difference, really. You get right down to it, except the difference that I make. Oh, okay. So what's going on in my consciousness that this is going on? So now I've stepped back even farther and I'm observing, what is my mind doing? What's going on in my mind? What's coming up in my mind? Okay. So this process, which is, there's nothing sophisticated about it, it's just paying attention, is in fact a process which begins to reveal what is going on. Now, Tsongkhapa and his followers, like the Dalai Lama, have said that understanding dependent origination is the king of the analytic understandings that leads to recognition of emptiness, dependent origination. Okay. What I've been talking about, what have I been talking about in this example of meowing and barking? I've been talking about dependent origination. For one thing, in the external physical world, the fact that Betty is walking through the room or that the dogs are barking, this is the result of causes. You know, Betty's walking through the room. There's a reason for it. I may not know what the reason is, but it is an example of causation. In every moment that she steps from one place in the room to another place in the room, with each moment of movement, there's cause and effect going on. All transformation is effect depending upon causes, and all transformation is causes which will produce effects. So now this is yet another level of abstraction in the meowing and barking scenario. Okay. So now my mind is sort of relating to Betty as an example of something entirely different. Now Betty the cat is an example of a fundamental Buddhist teaching about the impermanence of the world, the transformation and the changes that are going on in the world, and my relationship to those transformations and changes, which leads to an understanding of the empty nature of things. Because from one moment to the next, what's actually there? Now we're getting kind of abstract, I understand that. But this is all part of this analytic process of watching how the mind is reacting to this sort of field of experience that we're constantly engaged in, and seeing this field of experience as a way of getting at this fundamental existential misery. So now I've been weaving a lot of different things together here, you know, hopefully in a way which makes some kind of sense. But what I'm proposing is a way that ordinary folks like us can relate to this teaching as we're just doing our regular meditation practice. Now, if your regular practice is not just sort of like trying to calm the mind and focus one pointedly on something, like to practice shamatha, if your practice is to recite something, or maybe to do guru yoga, or an Avalokiteshvara meditation, or whatever the case may be, while you're doing all that stuff, all these distractions, here we are back to distractions, all these distractions are coming up. Cats are meowing, dogs are barking, so on and so forth, right? Usually it's said, okay, the distraction comes up, you just let go of it and you go back to what you were doing. Distractions come up, go back to what you're doing. The distractions come up, go back to what you're doing. You're trying to focus on an image of Avalokiteshvara, you get distracted by the barking dog, you go back to focusing your mind on the image. But the other thing you can do is you can disconnect yourself from the way your mind is reacting to the distraction as part of the meditation practice. That's what I'm saying, that ordinary folks like us can do, right? We can use the opponent as the teacher. The barking dog, which is the opponent, is now the teacher because it's teaching me something about my own mind. And the meowing cat is also the teacher because it's teaching me something about my own mind as I'm watching my mind as I'm trying to do the practice. My experience is that this leads into actual peace of mind. If you do it often enough, you actually get peaceful because the distractions don't go away, but you don't relate to them in the same way. Now, and what I've described is in no way different than anything that Kamalashila is describing in his book, in the Bhavanakrama. It's all there. I'm just putting it in terms that speak to my experience, following what the Dalai Lama said is teach from your own experience, right? So I'm not teaching from the point of view of experiencing shamatha. I'm teaching from the point of view of being an ordinary person with ordinary distractions and trying to find a way to make use of those things positively. Okay. Does that make existential suffering go away? No. Existential suffering doesn't go away. It's always there until you're liberated, until you're a Buddha. But there are different ways of relating to existential suffering. And one way of relating to it is consciously. Another way of relating to it is unconsciously. If you relate to it unconsciously, then you project the misery out into the world around you. And it creates problems for you. Like, how many politicians could I possibly be talking about? Or maybe better yet, how many oligarchs who are dabbling in politics could I possibly be talking about? I won't go through the names of these people. You'd recognize them, no? Right? So you see my point, I hope. Okay. I've been going on for a little over an hour now, and I think it's time to stop. But that doesn't mean that it's time to stop our conversation. It just means it's time for me to stop talking like I'm telling you something. So if there are questions or comments, that would be just fine. And if not, then I'll wrap this up and I'm going to go out and take a walk. So where are we at? I'm not getting any questions. which is nice because I'd actually like to take a walk. It's cooled off enough finally. It's, it's in the low 90s today. Kay and I were out. We thought we'd take a walk on Canyon Road just to remind ourselves that we're in Santa Fe. And it was so hot that we got maybe 10 minutes of walking in. And we said, that's it. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We should have been out there at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? But it's now 8 o'clock, so it's cooled off and I can take a walk. Okay? All right. Then we're good. Oh, wait. From Danny. Thank you. You're very welcome, Danny. So I'll come back next week, and this will be segue into more out of Kamalashila. And again, I'll try and teach from my own very simplistic understanding. Hopefully that's useful. Following on the Dalai Lama's teaching of speak from my own experience. Okay. Thank you for coming this evening. See you next week. Have a good week.